Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum viewers. I'm your host SM Hali, presenting another edition of Defense and Diplomacy. In the near past, we noticed that the miscreants, probably under stress because they have been hit hard by Operation Zarb-e-Azb, have started targeting the educational institutions. The state, of course, has resolved to hit back equally hard and make sure that the miscreants do not achieve their heinous task of keeping our younger generation away from the field of education. To discuss this very important, very significant development and what needs to be done, what is its social impact, we are honored to have in the studio today two very renowned guests. We have with us Atle Hetland, who is a social scientist and will be talking about the social aspect of this particular very heinous deed. And of course, we have with us Lieutenant General Raza, who is a renowned defense analyst. Let me start with you, General Raza. What do you think is the rationale behind the terrorists now aiming for the educational institutions?
Well, I think that's a smaller part of the terrorist strategy to terrorize their victims and more so, the civil society and the people of Pakistan. But one has to be, very clear about this entire context of whatever is happening in the region, in South Asia, in India, in Afghanistan, and also in Pakistan. And in that connection, with your permission, I'll just like to, quote very briefly from three very eminent people. The first one is the current National Security Advisor of India, Mr. Ajit Doval. Then the United Nations General Secretary. I'm going to quote from what he said on the 15th of January.
Ban Ki-moon.
Yes, to address the General Assembly. And finally, what the Pakistan Army's Chief of Army Staff said only yesterday in Balochistan. So, very quickly, on 26th November 2014, Mr. Ajit Doval said the following in his address at the Sastra University in India, and it says that Indian response to Pakistan should include disturbing Pakistan's economic, internal security and domestic political balance. He propounded the need for India to fight a fourth generation warfare against Pakistan. He threatened Pakistan with the loss of Balochistan in case events like the Mumbai attacks are repeated, and so on. The next quote is from the US UN Secretary General. As I said on the 15th January, he said that violent extremism is a direct assault on the United Nations Charter and a grave threat to international peace and security. Terrorists have brazenly distorted the peaceful values of religion and brutally murdered hundreds of thousands of innocents around the world. And he added that we need to recognize that today the vast majority of victims worldwide are Muslims. And finally, a quote from the Chief of Army Staff in Balochistan yesterday, and he says, I quote, terrorists are externally funded and internally facilitated. Foreign adversaries are eager to exploit any opportunity to destabilize Pakistan. They are harboring, training and funding dissidents and militants, and Balochistan has become a hotbed of proxy wars for external powers. So this is the kind of context, that we
exactly. You painted the whole scenario, and coming from three different sources, it does shed a lot of light on the rationale behind it. I'll come back to you. You made a very important point, General. But Atle, how do you see the social impact of this? Because remember, the attack on the 22nd of January 2016 on the Bacha Khan University was not the first one. We have had this heinous attack on 16th of December at the Army Public School in Peshawar, but we've also had attacks at the Islamic University in Islamabad, then the girls' buses which were targeted in Balochistan, and in between a number of them. So, and the terrorist stating that they want to keep our future generations away from education and keep them in darkness speaks volumes for their very dark agenda. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
I think in many ways they target soft targets, and I remember earlier even they went after a Christian hospital in Taxila more than 10 years ago. Then the school in Murray a bit later, and not so successful as seen from their point of view, but they went after certain targets symbolically perhaps, and schools also have a symbolic value for them, and they are also soft targets because we cannot make them into fortresses. Schools should not, and universities should have security, and architectural things can be done to make them more safe so that parents can send their children and youth to pleasant environments. But they must not become fortresses either. So it is impossible in a way to make such institutions totally safe, sadly. But
what about the social impact? Think of the trauma
Yes.
that the young child, the
Yes.
young boy or girl,
Yes.
because he or she has gone out to study, and educational institutions are supposed to be heavens of peace.
Oh, yes. Yes, you can talk, youth and older children, youth, adults can talk about the issues. I think smaller children should not be involved too much in talking about the issues. They should feel safe, even if they may not be 100% safe. However, this is not to make it less serious, but we also have other accidents. We have natural disasters, terrible natural disasters. We have terrible wars in this world. There are 60 million refugees in the world. There are many terrible things happening, and there are also a lot of traffic accidents and such things happening. And if we knew in advance and we try to make things safer, we try to make trains safer, we try to make cars safer, although I'm not always sure. They go very fast, many of these cars. And we don't separate pedestrians and the harder vehicles. So we are also a little bit careless about that. And although when tragic accidents happen, totally unnecessary, rather absolutely the opposite, then we are up in arms. And it's the people who die, but it's also those who are injured, and it's their relatives
Right.
and families.
Right.
So it is, and their friends at school, and so it's very sad. But I think we must also not paint the picture too negatively.
Exactly. The wherewithal we'll talk in a little while, but since you've had the experience of dealing with Afghan refugees for decades, in fact, in Pakistan, and their educational, but I'll just get back to you on this.
Yes.
General, you made a very important point about the rationale. But now the state has resolved, in fact, the state had resolved to head back right after the Army Public School attack and the National Action Plan came into being. A year has passed down the line, and then yet we see this particular incident happening. Do you think we are on the right track as far as tackling this, shall we say, demon of terrorism is concerned?
Absolutely. I think when the political parties across the board decided after the APS incident that they would formulate a national action plan. In fact, some call it a national action policy. Whether it's a policy or a plan, of course there are differences, and we'll not like to go into the semantics. But there was total consensus on those 20 points. And subsequently, it was reinforced with the National Internal Security Policy. Both these documents are extremely important documents. On the National Action Plan, on the 20 points, while action may appear to be slow, on some of them, I think there has been substantial progress on the main points, and as a consequence of that, the incidents of terrorism and deaths related to terrorism They have significantly reduced in this year from, let's say, about 4,000 2 years back per year to only 400 in the year 2015. So it is having an effect. Of course, there are odds against which the security agencies and the law enforcing agencies have to fight against. Then the entire civil society is still not involved in it. One would want to see the ownership of this plan being taken by the civil society, by the entire political class at the grassroots level. Only then we can hope to succeed in eliminating the scourge of terrorism from our society. The last 5 points of the National Action Plan, which are related to the regularizations of some of the seminaries who may be actually producing terrorists and extremists, again is an area of concern, on which I think the Ministry of Interior and the other concerned departments are working. And a dialogue is going on between the Wafaqul Madaris and the Ministry of Interior. Reforms, in the judiciary, in the police, are again important steps. Depoliticization of the police and the bureaucracy is again extremely important, particularly in the province of Sindh. As you can see, that there is this issue between the Rangers and the government of Sindh. You are aware that essentially in all countries of the world, tackling terrorism is the primary responsibility of the police. In this case, the police has gone in the background, and it is the Rangers which has come to the forefront. The Rangers should have actually been only in a supportive role. But this is not happening, and this is because the police and the civil services are politicized, and I think that needs to be looked after also.
Indeed. So I'm glad you mentioned the National Action Plan and elaborated some of it. But there's one aspect I'll be talking to you in a short while, but just to forewarn you about the revision of the syllabi, and especially eliminating the hate material, which somehow has seeped into some of our syllabus, whether advertently or inadvertently. I'll just get back to you, sir. As I had mentioned about your experience with the Afghan refugees, because they came from a war zone, highly traumatized, and you had a very successful experience. So could you share with our viewers, and can that be replicated for our children who are now being again bombarded with similar kinds of images?
Yes, I think a lot can be learned from the experience that Pakistan has had and still is having with Afghan refugees, and there is still 1.5 million or something like that here officially, and more. And Pakistan has given education to them and so on, and a lot of positive things have happened. Okay, I'm afraid I have to take a very short break. Yes, please. We'll pick up the thread from where we left it. Viewers, we are taking a short break. We'll just be back. We are discussing about the terrorists targeting our educational institutions. Stay tuned. We'll just be back. Welcome back, viewers. Before we went on the break, we were discussing the impact of the terrorists targeting the educational institutions. And to pick up the thread, Atle, you were talking about the trauma of the Afghan refugees in Pakistan. Yes, and a lot of good work was done in educational institutions. And Afghans went to school in Pakistan, in the camps, but very few outside the camps. But a lot of good work was done, and a lot of good lessons, important lessons, can be drawn from the experience Pakistan has. I have written about it myself, but I think we should dig deeper into it again, and my book is 10 years, or was up to 2005, and we could continue and take the next 10 years now, up to 2015, and draw more lessons and learn from it. And Pakistan should be proud of what it did, and Afghans should be proud of the way they have behaved in Pakistan also, and the way children have behaved, gone to school and be positive, and some have even gone to university and have gone back to Afghanistan and try to do what they can to help rebuild the country. But peace education is a tricky topic. I think when I worked in UNESCO, also here in Pakistan for a few years, mainly dealing with Afghan refugees, we focused on something called the International Decade for a Culture of Peace and Non-Violence. And there was a good poster, and it was we developed a lot of materials, and it was used worldwide. And
it talked about the do's and don'ts
yes.
which our youth should be concentrating
yes,
upon.
Yes, respect all life, reject violence, share with others, listen to understand, preserve the planet, rediscover solidarity. All these good messages, but it's not so easy to do in practice, and funds are not available. I would chop off 5% of any country's military budget and say, let us use it for peace education. For peace education in the whole society, in schools and in educational institutions. Maybe then there will be less need for corrective measures later.
Indeed, you see, Atle, you are a peacenik. And I can see where you're coming from. But you see, budgetary allocation for defense has to be in light with the threat perception. And here we're dealing with a very deadly enemy, but what you say makes sense. I'll come back to you and I would be asking you more about peace education. But General, you had made a very important point earlier also. And before we went on the break, we were talking to you and you had talked about the National Action Plan, and one of them has been to revise the syllabus and remove any literature or any aspect which leads towards hatred. So what are your thoughts on that, sir?
Well, I can only refer to you, to the syllabi and the books of my grandchildren that I see,
Okay.
who are going, to the mainstream education institutions of the country. And I can tell you with certainty that there isn't any hate speech of any kind in that. And therefore, you don't have to worry about this at all. Yes, if you go to some privately owned schools run by some obscure people, in the far-flung areas of the country, you might find this kind of inclination. But I think it's really a very small percentage of that, and we should not spend too much of time and energy on that, except in some of the religious seminaries that I mentioned earlier, who have refused to register themselves officially with the government of Pakistan. And perhaps it will be very difficult to go and intrude into their affairs. It has to be done. I mean, there certainly will be consequences, but we should not be afraid of that. We should be bold enough. It is the responsibility, of the government of Pakistan, all the law enforcing agencies of Pakistan, to make sure that such kind of hate speeches are totally removed. But generally speaking, in our mainstream education system and syllabi, I think we need to invest more on areas which can direct the students towards believing in pluralism.
Point taken, but actually that falls in the realm of what the state should be doing. But I'm glad you mentioned the caveat of the seminaries, because let me share with you and the viewers that after the areas of Swat, South Waziristan and North Waziristan were cleared of the miscreants, the Pakistan Army organized visit by analysts and media, and I happened to actually go and see the syllabus which was being taught in some of these, not only seminaries, but a few of them were terror training schools. And in that, so much hatred was being created. In fact, the hatred was also personified to elements of the Pakistan army.
True, yes.
And it was being projected that since the Pakistan army is fighting a war on terror, therefore it is an enemy of Islam, God forbid.
True, true. That's
And that is how young minds are
polluted. They are polluted, yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
So a lot needs to be done. So how do you combat, you are a peacenik, but I'm using a military term, how do you
Yes.
actually combat this kind of terrorism?
Yes, but what you say is true, of course, that maybe the textbooks don't have negative information intentionally, but it also depends on how things are read and how they are used, how good teachers are explaining issues. And if we start first with talking about the negative and the conflict aspects rather than talking about the positive and the cooperation aspects, showing respect, showing mercy when things happen, knowing that the holy books say that we should love our enemy. We should not do anything to anybody that we also do not want them to do to us. So all these may be naive, but these are in the holy books. These are the good and the basic thoughts of philosophy, of religion, of faith that we should all focus on before we talk about other issues. And I think in Pakistan, I'm sitting here with a great book, a little book by Karen Armstrong.
Yes,
and
a letter to Pakistan.
A letter to Pakistan, where she always comes back to the golden rule, which I mentioned. Do unto others what you want others to do unto you, or you can turn it the other way, and it will be that positive message. So I think we should try and I think people want to do exactly what the holy books teach us, but in practice, and children understand it much better than we do as adults. Your grandchildren will know what is fair. This is not fair, they will say. This is not right if something they feel is unjust is done to them. So we should try to use this as a basis in education, and we should have courses. We should have it as a curriculum before we talk about anything else. And I know parents talk about these issues at home, mothers even more than fathers. In kindergarten, they talk about these issues. I hope we don't switch when they come to primary school and we talk about all the dangers of the world too much. We should talk about the positive aspects, and that's the only way, I think, that we can change. And then we also have to show respect. That's extremely important. It's the basic in all community, all communication between people. Show respect to each other, and there must be equality. I have a friend who says, no, we cannot be totally equal, but we should be just to each other. There should be justice. It should be fair. And these are I think in the West now also, they need to talk about these issues. Now when they have influx of refugees in Europe and other forced or voluntary migrants, they also have to talk about these positive issues, saying we have to welcome. And then you can say, yes, well, it's not practical. No, but educational institutions must talk about this. They must emphasize it. Religious institutions, preachers in Islam, in Christianity, all of them must talk about these issues, and then others can tell them, you are not quite realistic. All right, but we have to talk about it.
Exactly. You see, Atle, the beauty is that all divine religions,
yes,
they teach the same ethics,
yes,
of doing unto others what you want done unto you,
yes,
and being kind to your fellow beings, and so on.
Yes.
It is the terror mongers who distort the words of, let's say, the Quran or
yes,
the Bible or the Torah, and
yes,
instigate people.
And if we start talking about it, and all of us want people to live in peace and harmony and in development and prosperity, if we start talking using the language of the terrorists and let they have the upper hand and the agenda, then we are also doing wrong.
Indeed. When I come back to you, I'll be asking you about the role of opinion builders in reducing intolerance or removing intolerance from society, because perhaps that is one of the reasons why these people behave in this manner. But General, you had mentioned about one of the, I'm coming back to the initial quote which you made about Ajit Doval talking about the fourth generation warfare. Now this is extremely serious. How do you interpret it?
Well, I think in his talk there in the university, he talked for about an hour and a half, and his speech is available on YouTube. You can see it in Pakistan. And he has given his own interpretation, of the fourth generation warfare, and he's talked of what the first, second, and the third generation warfare is. And in his word, it says that do more covert operations in your enemy's countries. This is the first point.
But this is the Chanakyan theory.
Yeah, this is what it is. This is one. The other is that he says you buy terrorists, you buy proxies, give them 1.5 times more money, and use terrorists against your adversaries. This is what he says. And he says that because now a conventional war in the nuclear overhang in the subcontinent is not possible, therefore India needs to resort to the fourth generation warfare against Pakistan, which is very unfortunate. Coming from the National Security Advisor of a country who is saying that the state should hire terrorists to be employed in another country. It is totally inexcusable. This is how I feel about it.
But the redeeming factor is that perhaps this was made in November 2014.
Yes, but he is following that. Look at his actions, and he perhaps is now the strongest man, politician. He's not a politician, he's an intelligence bureau officer who served for 6 years in Pakistan as India's undercover agent.
And there's a video on YouTube available to that effect.
Available, and it's not, when you talk of the Doval doctrine, that talk which he gave there in the university is now the doctrine, the national security doctrine of India. It is being followed, and this has been repeated by the Indian defense minister. It is being seen in the actions of the government of India. It is very unfortunate, but this is what is happening. But coming back to what we were talking about, and I talked of the UN Secretary General's talk, and he again mentioned of tackling the root causes of terrorism, in the entire world. And he's saying that we are actually emphasizing right now on treating more of the symptoms than the causes. Whether it is in India or in Pakistan or in Afghanistan, we know what are the underlying root causes. In India, of course, the main cause is Kashmir. They're not even talking about it. In Afghanistan, it is the issue, of the legitimacy of the government, and whether the government is willing to talk to the warring factions or not, and so on.
If you permit, sir, in fact, viewers, we'll be taking a very short break. It's a very intense discussion going on about the terrorists targeting our educational institutions and what the state and we, the people of Pakistan, need to do about it. But we are taking a short break. Stay tuned. We'll just be back. Welcome back, viewers. Before we went on the break, we were discussing the miscreants and terrorists targeting educational institutions in Pakistan. So, Atle, would you care to discuss and inform our viewers what needs to be done by the opinion builders of society to curb intolerance which has seeped into our very genes?
Yes. The General already mentioned that the NGOs and the organizations that we have in society have not quite taken up these issues to the extent, at least, that we want it to happen. And when I worked in UNESCO, I remember we used to say, well, there are peace organizations, peace NGOs, but most of them are Christian, we thought, and good and well, but we also need the mainstream organizations to be involved in peace issues. And I think there is a lot to be done by NGOs, by religious organizations. I think in a country like Pakistan, religious organizations must be on board. And a lot of the foundation in society comes from religion in Pakistan and in all societies, whether we want to admit it in the West or not. I think a lot of the ethics and the moral and the issues that we build our society on and the way we deal with each other and work together come from the religious foundation. Culturally, we may be religious and we may have faith. This is very important. And Pakistan must do much more and can do much more in these fields. And then we go from civil society, from the media. There should be campaigns all the time in Pakistan about how we can include everybody in this beautiful country, in the society, so that terrorists don't feel at all attracted to extremism and to do something against the state and against other people. Because when these terrible incidents, and the general said, they are fewer now than before, I'm very glad this is the case indeed. But when these things happen, I also feel very sorry for those perpetrators. It is terrible for them also and for their families, and I can't understand how they can do it, but that is how it is. In some cases, maybe they have been paid, maybe they don't believe in what they are doing. It's terrible. It is terrible for the victims and their families, and it is also terrible and very difficult for the law enforcement agencies, for the military, and all those who do a good job. And I think we should give them credit for what has happened. As a peace activist that I am, I would also say, of course, the army, the police, the security officers and so on, they do what they have to do, but they are not going to solve the situation. They are curing, but
Indeed.
others have to do the prevention.
Indeed. So as a final point, General Raza, and you've been the president of the National Defense University, one of the pinnacles of education as far as our society is concerned. How do we inculcate into our society the feeling that we are all on the same page, we are fighting a common enemy, and an enemy that can destroy us unless we tackle it?
I think there have to be more awareness seminars than what is currently being held. There has to be dialogues. There has to be dialogues with our adversaries as well. And Pakistan has been very flexible on that. If you recall, even after the Pathankot incidents, Pakistan did not shy away from continuing the process of the comprehensive dialogue with India or with others. The education institutions are there, they're looking at what is happening around them, what is happening in the world. They're naturally influenced by major events, and therefore it's very difficult, to keep them totally isolated from the events around them. For instance, right now, during the US presidential race, if Mr. Donald Trump is talking about banning the entries of the Muslims from the world into the United States, or asking for carpet bombing, the Middle Eastern education, Middle Eastern cities. So I think it will be very difficult for the universities or, for the peace-making or a peace-building institution that he's talking about. But, well, one can continue the efforts in that direction. The education institutions, whether they are civil or the military, they are the foundation layers of the future generation of this country. And the faculty there has to be very matured. They have to make sure, you know, that they educate them with the correct perspective of everything. For instance, yesterday, you know, we were here and we were talking that probably, you know, the people of the United States will reject ideas which Mr. Trump is propagating. The society there is very matured.
But you can see that it has been transformed into the Iowa caucus.
True,
That
yeah.
Mr. Trump did not lead it. He has
That's
come
true.
a distant second.
True. Yeah. So it's this kind of interpretation, I think, with which the faculty in the institutions they have to put in the minds of you know, the very formative minds of the students there. And if that is done, I think we collectively will succeed, you know, in defeating the terrorists.
Indeed. Viewers, with that we wrap up this discussion. It has been very intense. Both our participants, one a military general but also an educationist, and the other a social scientist and a peace activist, gave their viewpoints. The collective information gathered in a nutshell is that yes, Pakistan is facing a very difficult period of its life, where the terrorists have now turned towards targeting the educational institutions, which only shows its desperation. But we cannot allow our innocent children and the students to become not only cannon fodder, but to destroy our future, because our youth is our future, our students are our future. And in a country where the literacy rate is already dismally pretty low. So in order to fight back, the state of course has devised the National Action Plan, but it takes two to tango, and here the two means not only government but the people of Pakistan. Every member of society has to play his or her role in identifying the terrorist, in making sure that the terrorist does not make a dent into our social fiber. If we have to stand up and to be counted as a nation, we have to be united on this one single front. I'd like to thank you, Raza. I'd like to thank you, Atle, Hetland. It's been a pleasure listening to both of you. Viewers, keep watching us. Hope to see you tomorrow in the next program, inshallah. Allah Hafiz.